Hello and welcome to Known News Weekly with your host, Lisa Gallington. Today is Saturday, February 7th, 2026. Today we will be looking at the recent headlines related to anti-Semitism. There have been lots, so we're going to jump right into the headlines. The anti-Semitism headlines this week were from all over the country, all over the world. So I'm going to just show you a handful of them. There were literally dozens and dozens. The first one I have here is from Germany on January 31st. Anti-Semitism is coming from many directions and it's growing. Also, January 31st from here in the United States, anti-Semitic incidents have been surging across the entire United States. A Jewish school in Paris was vandalized on February 2nd. And on February 3rd, Australia had a headline, Filthy Zionist, Lecturer in Court Over Tirade. And on February 4th, in the United Kingdom, there's a headline that the United States might offer asylum to British Jews. Also on February 4th, in the United States, 182% surge in New York anti-Semitic crimes during Mamdani's first month in office. This was the main headline that we're going to focus on today. And in Australia on the 5th, drifting towards anti-Semitism. And in the United States on the 5th, Jewish New Yorkers blame Mayor Mamdani as anti-Semitism explodes. Is anti-Semitism a sign of the end times? Well, we should be able to tell because God has made known the end from the beginning, from ancient times, what is still to come. He says his purpose will stand and he will do all that he pleases. Yes, the Bible foretells an increase in anti-Semitism in the end times. There's lots of references. The first one we're going to look at is this Zechariah 14:2. And in the end times, it says that God will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle. And the city will be taken over, the houses rifled, and the women ravished, and half the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Ezekiel 38:16, in the context of the end time, the battle of Gog and Magog, speaking to Gog, God says, "And you will come up against my people Israel like a cloud covering the land. In the latter days I will bring you against my land, that the nations may know me, when through you, O Gog, I vindicate my holiness before their eyes." There's lots and lots of other references, but three that are clearly end times passages that talk about persecution and anti-Semitism coming forward. Daniel 12:1, clearly about the Jews in the end times and being hated. Matthew 24:9, all nations will hate you because of me. I believe that verse is referencing Christians in addition to Jews. Revelation 12:13, however, is speaking specifically of the Jews, and later in that same chapter of the Christians as well. There are many other last days references that state the same idea, that the Jews will be hated. Therefore, we should expect to see all these anti-Semitism headlines in the news this week. Let's dig in a bit deeper into one of the major headlines from this week. This headline is from Fox News. New York City anti-Semitic incidents nearly triple despite other crimes reaching record lows. 182% soar in January. So the article gives a whole lot of details and information. We're going to dig into this. So some of the stats in here are that anti-Semitic incidences in New York City nearly tripled in January, even as other crimes reached record lows. Anti-Jewish hate crimes rose 182%, with 31 reported incidents compared to 11 in January of last year. And those made up more than half of all hate crimes reported in January. The total number of hate crimes was 56, which was up 152% over the same period last year. And the Anti-Defamation League, or ADL, described the spike in anti-Semitic incidents as staggering. Some examples of various incidents were swastikas at a Borough Park playground, a car ramming at Chabad headquarters in Crown Heights, that this is being investigated as a hate crime. Another example is a high school student sent emails threatening to kill all his Jewish classmates. And another one is that Jews have been targeted in 55% of all hate crimes in New York City so far this year, an increase of 14% over last year. I watched videos this week of interviews with various Jewish people. They are really afraid for their lives. I saw videos where walking down the street, Jewish people dressed in their standard attire were being just slugged in the face by a passerby or nudged and pushed to the ground. And it seemed to be happening all over the place. Before I go into why anti-Semitism has increased, I'm going to start out by giving you just a brief biblical history of hatred towards the Jews. The Egyptian slavery, and then in the entire time they were in the Promised Land, they were hated by the nations around them. During the rebuilding of the temple in Ezra chapter 4, it's recorded how people came and tormented them and fought against their rebuilding. And the same thing happened when Nehemiah was there rebuilding the walls. While they were in Babylonian captivity, the leaders brought charges against the Jews because the Jews refused to worship the statue of Nebuchadnezzar. And also the leaders brought false charges against Daniel because Daniel was blessed by God and they were jealous of him. So they hated the Jews in Babylon. Also during that same time period over in Persia, Haman had this awful hatred towards the Jews, set up a plot to destroy the Jews, and as the twist of the story goes, he ended up killed on his own gallows that he had set up for the Jews. And then Claudius commanded the Jews to leave Rome, and that's recorded in Acts chapter 18. But that anti-Semitism continued into the church. Supersessionism or replacement theology began when early converts from Judaism to Christianity sought to distinguish themselves from their unsaved Jewish relatives who had rejected Jesus, the perfect Jew. This divide between Jews and Jewish converts to Christianity grew after the fall of Rome and the diaspora. No more Israel as a nation might mean that all those Old Testament prophecies about the future of Israel were now for the church. By the 2nd century and into the 3rd century, some Christians had rejected their Jewish heritage and began teaching that since the Jews rejected Jesus, God had therefore rejected the Jews. This then became a predominant teaching of Catholicism. It was ingrained in the Reformers and brought in as a key teaching in the early Protestant churches. It wasn't until the Second Vatican Council in the early 1960s that Catholicism rejected this and acknowledged that Christians and Jews have a common spiritual heritage and that Christians should seek mutual understanding and appreciation for the Jews. Unfortunately, anti-Semitism has persisted in some Protestant denominations. The October 7th attacks in Israel and the pro-Palestinian narrative that came out of that have brought about an emphasis of replacement theology teaching in the churches around the globe. So this replacement theology is not biblical truth. There are plenty of scriptures that speak against it and declare that God is not done working with the Jews. He still loves the Jews. Many of these passages are going to be using phrases like my people, my land, my inheritance. That's what God thinks of the land of Israel and of the people of Israel. They're his chosen people. And in these passages, it talks about in the end times when Jesus will return and set up his kingdom. He will set his kingdom up in Jerusalem on Mount Zion. It even talks about the various tribes by name coming back. It's clearly Israel-centric. So God is not done working with the Jews. You can look through these passages on your own, but I do want to focus in on the Romans 11. Most of that chapter is Paul's expression of his desire to see the Israelites saved. But what Paul points out in the chapter, that God is not done. He's allowed Israel to have a falling away or to have a disbelief at this point so that Gentiles could be saved. And that will continue until the full number of the Gentiles has come in. But he also includes a warning there for the Gentile believers or the modern day Christians that we should not become arrogant, because if God could cut off the natural branch the Jews from his olive tree, then he certainly can cut us off as well. We need to be careful to not be arrogant and think that we are superior to the Jews. So what are some other reasons why anti-Semitism has increased? One is neutrality towards the hatred is permission. During the Holocaust period, it all started out as just distraction by the church. They weren't paying attention to what was going on with the Jews, and that hatred that began to grow for the Jews and wasn't addressed became permission to attack them. The media itself promotes anti-Semitism, and we're going to go ahead and look at an article on that. This is a very long article, so I'm going to just sort of summarize it here. The problem is not that the media tells lies about Israel, Gaza, or the Jews. They do, of course, but not all that often. The problem lies not with false reporting, but with what is left unmentioned in order to save a good story, or at any rate, a politically popular and profitable one. Certain sections of Western opinion on the liberal center and moderate left, as well as on the extreme left and parts of the extreme right, are now committed to a view of Israel and the Jews having almost no contact with reality, that it is a colonial, racist, apartheid Nazi state, which should never have been allowed to come into existence and deserves to be removed from the world stage as soon as possible. How social media stokes anti-Semitism and what we can do about it. So I'm just going to pull up the summary here. Anti-Semitism has surged on social media. Jews are feeling it and seeing it. You've got some anonymity. There's a global reach. So everybody around the world can contribute and say whatever, and we can now pull up posts from people all over the world. And there's nations of the world where anti-Semitism has been really bad for a long time, and now that's getting spread to other parts of the world. Another reason that anti-Semitism is growing is because of the education system. So we're going to also look at an article on this. Anti-Semitism in independent K-12 schools post-October 7th. What I want to really focus on is the different points that are made here. Is, for example, swastikas and biased curricula are prominent issues in independent K-12 schools. Parents believe independent school responses to anti-Semitism have fallen short. Anti-Semitism is underreported to school leadership and faculty at independent schools. And I think part of that is because the Jewish students are afraid to report. Current non-discrimination programming and DEI frameworks are failing to include Jewish identity, and Jewish families are feeling pushed to the margins in independent schools. The school system doesn't do a whole lot to prevent anti-Semitism, but much of the curriculum actually eliminates the truth about the Holocaust and various things, which also makes the truth about the Jews not apparent, and therefore it's easy to believe the lies. Addressing this issue requires collective action, including education, reporting mechanisms, and platform accountability to curb online hate. So we're going to see in a minute that these efforts are being made, and we'll talk about that here in a few. So what is being done about the anti-Semitism? There's some cute things being done. Did you see the Super Bowl ad this year? Something a little bit more practical being done is a Senate investigation into what's been going on, particularly in New York City. So the Senate is investigating because of Mayor Mamdani's decision to rescind multiple executive orders related to combating anti-Semitism and opposing BDS policies. The first day in office, Mamdani backed out several of these different things that had been set in place by prior administrations to protect the Jews. Senators warned that those moves may violate federal civil rights protections and could jeopardize the $2.2 billion in federal education funding that the U.S. government gives New York City. So these key executive orders that Mamdani revoked One was a 2025 order establishing the mayor's office to combat anti-Semitism. A separate order prohibiting city officials from enacting policies that discriminate against Israel or Israeli citizens. Both orders were originally signed by the former mayor, Eric Adams. The Senate's concerns include that rescinding these protections may weaken safeguards for Jewish students. He emphasizes that anti-Semitism in New York City is a lived reality and requires strong institutional protections. The Senate is questioning whether Mamdani consulted federal agencies before making the changes. And another thing being investigated is Mamdani's previously stated positions, where he called Israel an apartheid state and he openly supported the BDS movement. He has also criticized the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, claiming it conflates criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. An additional survey that they're looking into found that 53% of Jewish voters in New York City feel threatened by Mamdani's statements and those of his allies. And the New York City Health Department staff recently formed a working group accusing Israel of genocide, something that may have been prohibited under the now revoked Adams order. What else is happening around the world to stop anti-Semitism? Germany is calling for vigilance and collective responsibility to remember the Holocaust and their part in the Holocaust. They want to teach the facts. There's also a call European Union-wide to coordinated action against rising anti-Semitism. The whole European Union needs to rigorously address anti-Semitism, says a person named Martarella. So will these effects stop anti-Semitism? No. God says this is a sign of the end times. Remember that when God said what would happen in the end times, he declared it from the beginning, and he said that these are his purposes and they will stand, and he will bring about all that he pleases. So why doesn't God stop anti-Semitism? He's an all-powerful God. If he loves the Jewish people, he certainly could. Well, biblically, God has a pattern of using enemies to move his people back to Israel. And remember that the Bible says that the Jews returning to Israel is going to happen in the end times. So one example of that historically is when they were in Egypt, and they were happy in Egypt, and then slavery came upon them. And as the Egyptians mistreated them and abused them, they fled. Then as they went into the Exodus and they were in the wilderness and they went into the promised land, God caused them to have all sorts of other enemies. They turned their backs on God and they were taken into captivity in Babylon. In Babylon and in Persia, they were again persecuted. And as they were persecuted, that gave them the desire to go home, and they went back to Israel. And then back in the 1800s, the pogroms of the Russian and European areas caused the anti-Semitism to increase, and the Jews again fled those areas and went back to Israel. Persecution actually strengthens people. God has a remnant of Jews who will be saved. They are being strengthened to endure the coming time of Jacob's sorrows, the Great Tribulation. So I think this anti-Semitism is actually helping to fulfill biblical prophecy. God is using it for his purposes. So how should we respond to the anti-Semitism? First of all, do not be against Israel. In the passages that we didn't read from the Old Testament, it gives many examples of what God's going to do in the last days to the nations and the enemies of Israel. Genesis 12:3 tells us to bless Israel so that God will bless you. So be sure that you're a person who blesses Israel and doesn't curse Israel. Another way to combat anti-Semitism is just to remember that Jesus was a Jew. The Bible tells us this in both Romans chapter 9, verse 5 and Hebrews 7, verse 14. Jesus was a Jew. We have to remember God still loves the Jews. Zechariah 2:8 says that the Jews are the apple of God's eye. We need to agree with God on that. If we consider the Jews the apple of our eye, we won't fall into anti-Semitism. And God gives a prayer request in Psalm 122, verse 6, that we should pray for the peace of Jerusalem. The more we pray for the peace of Jerusalem, the more we will come to love the Jews. So I hope during the coming week that you will bless the Jews, that you will love the Jews, that you will pray for the peace of Jerusalem, and that you'll stand up for the Jews when you see anti-Semitism in your area or in your sphere of influence. Until next week, may the Lord bless you.